Okay, so we were discussing the fascinating story of the Tree of Knowledge, story that captured people's attentions for thousands of years. It's got all the elements of a good drama. It's got temptation. It's got sin. It's got all kinds of interesting things. Of course, there's as the first story of the Torah that discusses, human nature and the struggle of free choice within the human being. There's a tremendous amount of insight and a tremendous amount of lessons that we can derive from that story about the nature of the universe, the nature of the Torah, what exactly we're supposed to be doing on this earth, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a lot to discuss. So we began discussing the story last week when we discussed the concept, just the basic concept of, so what exactly is the tree of knowledge? In other words, the the Torah says that God plants within the garden a tree of knowledge of good and evil. And the Torah says that God tells Adam that the day you will consume of the fruit of the tree of knowledge, mo tamut, you will surely die. And the first question that we raised is a question that virtually all the commentaries ask is, what is the problem with knowledge? Why is knowledge seen as something negative, right? We say, if the Torah would say, well, you can really taste everything in this garden, which is a metaphor for you can engage in anything in this earth. You can benefit from anything except one thing, right? What would I think that what would we picture that thing to be? Obviously, something negative and something bad. So if you're saying that the knowledge of good and evil is bad, that means somehow knowledge itself is problematic. And why is knowledge problematic? So that is the question that virtually all the commentaries ask. We also asked from another angle. We asked, it seems like man through sin benefits from the sin, because before the sin he's missing knowledge, and post the sin, because of the sin, he gains knowledge. So that is a moral problem, because it seems like it's unjust. In the language of the literature, choten niskar, how is it that the sinner would benefit? Because I sinned and violated God's commandments, and that's why I'm rewarded with knowledge, right? The Torah understands that people are incentivized. People follow the incentives. It seems like the incentives here are out of balance. You do something bad, you get knowledge. Again, same essential question. What's the nature of this knowledge? And I'm just repeating because these are important concepts. So last week we offered at least two interpretations. What did we offer last night? Oh, we offered two interpretations. One interpretation was that from Maimonides, and different people say it in different words. Just a few hundred years later, people are articulating the same ideas in a different language, but it's essentially the same concept. And that is that Maimonides says that before that we consume the fruit of the tree, the nature of our knowledge was not good and evil, but it was true and false. And the way Maimonides describes these concepts, even though I don't know if it carries over in the English, but true and false would mean objective knowledge. And good and evil, Maimonides defines as subjective knowledge. So in other words, today, when I look at a scenario or an experience, I ask myself, is this good? What I mean is it good for me? What I mean is, how does it make me feel? And that's how I determine whether I think it's good. So the questions I ask myself is not, is this objectively good? I ask myself, is it good for me? And that is the result of the fruit of the tree of knowledge. And that is a downgrade. So our question was, how could it be that God thinks knowledge is bad? So what we're saying is subjective knowledge is actually a downgrade from objective knowledge. If you lived in a world of objective knowledge, the only question you're asking is this objectively good, regardless how it makes me feel? And if we lived in a world where we're only thinking about objective good, that is the Garden of Eden. That's tranquility, that's peace, that's health. Because almost all our vices comes from the fact that there's a separation between what is actually good and what makes us feel good in the moment. And the fact that we are attracted to what makes us feel good in the moment in the language of the Torah, that's good and bad, as opposed to truth and falsehood. So that's Maimonides' ways of articulating this idea. And as we said before, that many other people said it in other words. In other words, the following, many commentators post Maimonides said it in their own words. But that's one big idea. That's fascinating. Another, we spoke about, we also spoke about the Hasidic angle. And the Hasidic angle was that the issue here is the word da'at, knowledge. And I'm not going to go through everything at length because we said it last week already. But in Hasidic terminology, there's a difference between wisdom and understanding and knowledge. And knowledge, what knowledge means in this context is knowledge that affects me. So certain things I know about, but they have absolutely no impact on my life. That is considered wisdom and understanding. That's abstract knowledge. But then if the knowledge will affect my heart, that's because the attribute of knowledge, of da'at, was triggered. So for example, you can explain to me that something is unhealthy. I could understand it. I could pass the test. But if I still desire it, it's because my knowledge was not triggered. If I am able, but through meditation or other ways, if I am able to awaken my knowledge, then that information in my head actually affects my heart. So in other words, what happens when you consume the fruit of this tree is that what you know affects how you feel. And that is a problem, because in this world, post the tree of knowledge, knowing of evil will give us an emotional connection to evil by definition. So somebody says, I don't know, this is not a perfect example, so don't quote me on this. It's not a perfect example, but maybe it is. I have to think about it. So you have to think about violent video games. So people sit and shoot each other up for 10 hours a day. And they say, what's the problem? I'm not doing anything bad. I'm not hurting anybody. It's just entertainment. Now, are they right or are they wrong? So in some sense, the argument that what I see and what I engage in does not affect me, in some sense, that's an argument. That's not true post the fruit of the tree of knowledge, at least from the Hasidic reading, because the problem with the fruit of the tree of knowledge is that once you consume it, what you know ultimately is you're going to feel connected to it. So we lose the ability to have knowledge that's separate, in other words, wisdom and understanding separate from my emotional bond, which is knowledge. Again, we said last week that according to the Kabbalah, the attribute of knowledge is the key between the mind and the heart. So if you have no knowledge, you're very wise, you're very understanding, you know the information, you will pass all the tests, but that doesn't affect your own behavior. The Hasidim say a story. I have no idea if it's true. Probably doesn't matter if it's true. The story is still a good story. So the story is told. Okay, I don't know if I should say the story if I don't know if it's true, but I'll say it anyway. So the Hasidim say that there was a story that it was supposed to be a famous story. So maybe people know the story. The point is that Aristotle, who of course was a great philosopher and thought and spent a lot of time thinking about what's the right way to live and what's the moral way to live. So the story is told that once his students walk into his home, and all of a sudden they catch him engaged in a behavior that's less than moral, to say the least. So they're in shock. Here's their teacher. Their teacher spends so much time thinking about and articulating exactly what morality means. And here he's engaged in something that is not moral. And according to the legend, Aristotle tells his students, says, now I'm not Aristotle. In other words, Aristotle is the state of the mind. Whether or not that philosophy affects your heart, that's irrelevant, right? I can go to university, I can give a good lecture, and then I am Aristotle. But when I go home, does that philosophical belief have to affect me? Not necessarily. Who says that I have to live the way by what I understand and what I believe, right? Because I'm a divorce lawyer, does that mean I have to divorce my wife, right? What does one got to do with the other? You have an expertise, but your expertise does not have to affect your life. And that's unfortunately, in other words, if that story is true, there is that phenomenon where I know something to be true. I have a theory, but that theory does not necessarily affect me. And the question of whether it will or will not affect me depends on my da'at, whether my da'at was triggered. Because the da'at is the key that connects what I understand to how I feel. Now the question becomes, before the tree of knowledge, what was the state of Adam and Eve? They had an understanding and knowledge, but that understanding and evil. But they knew something exists that was supposed to be enticing, but they didn't necessarily feel connected to that. Once we engage in the fruit of the tree of knowledge, at this point, that we feel connected to the evil, and that's why our temptation and therefore the free choice that follows is much more complicated. That's basically what we discussed last week in a nutshell. Of course, there's a lot more to say. Okay, so that's two of the interpretations, but don't worry, we're not done. We still have more interpretations of whether or not, what exactly is the definition of the tree of knowledge. But if anybody wants to make any comments or questions, please go ahead. Otherwise, we continue.
One question, Rabbi.
Yes.
Is it fair to draw any kind of a parallel between the tree of knowledge and the Torah? In that the Torah wasn't given, we didn't get Matan Torah until Hashem thought we were ready to receive it. And in the tree of knowledge, there were precepts that we were not prepared, or Adam was not prepared to receive. So is it fair to say that there is some sort of a parallel between the two concepts?
Yes. So according to the Kabbalah, the Torah that we have is both. In other words, Torah, we didn't yet get there, but there's also the tree of life, and the tree of life is also part of the story. The Torah says that in the Garden of Eden there was the tree of life, and the reason why Adam and Eve were expelled from the Garden of Eden is because God feared that they may eat of the tree of life after they ate of the tree of knowledge, and therefore God expelled them from the tree of knowledge, and He put guards, as we will discuss when we get there, to make sure that they don't approach the tree of life. So what is the tree of life and what is the tree of knowledge? So the Kabbalah tells us that the Torah too has two aspects. I feel like I'm back in Brooklyn with hearing the fire department doing their good work. So it's a good feeling to be on Mason Street again. Okay. So the Torah too has both aspects of tree of life and tree of knowledge. What do I mean? So when you study Torah, there's two types of Torah you study. Sometimes we get together and we study Kabbalah, or we study the secrets of the Torah. What are we talking about? We're talking about God. What does that mean? There's no evil involved. But then we study Torah and we actually discuss evil things. My father would say, why are we teaching Talmud in the 3rd grade? All we're doing is teaching the kids how to lie. Because you study the Talmud, you see this litigant makes this claim. The other litigant makes the other claim. It's our job to figure out who's the liar. So in the process, the kids learn how to lie. It's only half joking. But the point is, that's the job of the Torah. The job of the Torah is to descend to the real world where there is good and evil, where some people are saying the truth and some people are only saying half truth and some people are outright lying. And we occupy ourselves trying to figure out what to do in that arena where there is good and evil. And I don't know that we always get to the right answer, but the point is we have to try to get to the right answer. So according to the Kabbalah, there are different parts of Torah. So there is the part of Torah that engages in good and evil. And that is almost a step down from the essence of Torah, which would be the tree of life. But we can't get to the tree of life before we deal with the good and evil. So there are certainly parallels between the story. Again, the story is true on many, many planes. So this idea that part of reality is the struggle between good and evil, but then there's the tree of life, which we could transcend. You get to the place that there is no good and evil, and that sort of precedes. But once you taste the good and evil, you can't go backward. Then you have to deal with the evil. You can't ignore it. And that happens within the Torah as well, because the Torah is a reflection the Torah is here to affect reality. So now that the world has been affected by the tree of knowledge, So the part of Torah we need to combat or to help the world or to enlighten the world is the part of Torah, the revealed part of the Torah, which the Zohar refers to as the tree of knowledge, as opposed to the hidden part of Torah, the mystical part of Torah. The Zohar refers to that as the tree of life. So there are certainly parallels.
Rabbi,
Yes,
Rabbi,
yes.
is it possible that God created this scenario, and he wanted, you see, Eve knew all of this, I think, but Adam didn't. And he wanted Adam to actually, this was supposed to happen on purpose. So Adam would go down and be in the world and have to think and work at it and make decisions. He wanted us to make decisions. He wanted us to experience good and evil, so we would have the choice of making good and evil, of what to do. If we did the wrong thing and we corrected it, we then would feel good and we would be right. We would be okay. If we made the right choice the first shot out, then we would feel good. He wanted us to take action down here, and this is the whole point of it, that it really was meant to be this way, so man would think and behave and be for himself. That's what procreation is. That's the mitzvah.
Right. So let's think about this for a
The
second.
right life.
So
Rabbi,
this is
could I just add to something that Seth said? My question revolves around why it was Eve that was chosen to break the rule, or to, even though she supposedly didn't know, but the story chooses her to be the one to carry the blame.
She didn't break the rules. She knew. She was she was wise.
Well, it was
God,
a snake, supposedly, whatever that meant.
because we like Jill, because we like to blame the woman. No, I'm only kidding.
no, the woman.
But that is what happened in history, and that's what happened in Christianity.
Right.
And the effect of that was exactly that. But
Right.
why did this? It was addressed to the people of the time, and
Right.
this.
So let's do one thing at a time. Let's do one thing at a time. We'll deal with Seth's question, and then we'll deal with Jill's question, and then we still have to go back to Nachmanides, and we have to go back to that Barbanel. We're
Right,
busy.
so you can skip my question and just move forward.
No, I want to address Seth's question briefly, and then Jill's question briefly. The answer, it's a very tricky concept to say what Seth is saying. It's certainly true, and it's certainly according to the Kabbalah, that Adam and Eve understood that there's a certain benefit in violating the commandment. In other words, that when you violate the commandment, even though you're going against God's will, there's a certain benefit to that, even a spiritual benefit, because if you sin, let's start with what we know. Says the Talmud, who is greater? Let me ask you a question. Who's greater? Someone who never sinned, or someone who sinned and repented? Or Baal Teshuvah, someone who returns to God. So the Talmud says that someone who returns to God is greater than someone who never sinned, for many reasons. First of all, the person who's never sinned, you don't know what would happen if he does sin. Maybe he didn't sin because he had no opportunity to sin. And if he would sin, who said he would have the strength to turn his life around? So somebody who sins and turns his life around is a much greater level. In addition to that, the person who sins and then turns his life around actually has a deeper appreciation for holiness, right? The person who never felt the distance from God doesn't really appreciate the closeness to God. So there are many, many interpretations that explain the Talmudic statement that a Baal Teshuvah, someone who returns to God, is on a greater level than a tzaddik, than a righteous person who never sinned. Okay? So in that sense, it's very likely that Adam and Eve, especially Eve, and this is where Jill's question overlaps Seth's question, especially Eve, sense innately that there's a certain benefit to taking the road of violating the law and then experiencing the negativity and then transforming the negativity. So it's very tempting, pun intended. We're reading the story of the tree of knowledge. It's very tempting to say so. Very tempting to say so, and I would agree. I would say so. I have no problem saying that. It gets a little bit more tricky to say, what did God want? Short answer is I don't know. But what I would say is as follows. If you're a parent, you think about it like this. You don't want your children to fail. even though if I come to you and I explain to you a fact, and let's say this is true, let's assume this is true, that if your child fails and then overcomes the failure, your child will be in a better place. He'll be more prepared for the world. He'll be more prepared for, he'll have a deeper understanding and appreciation for success, et cetera, et cetera. I'll give you the whole book. But the problem is that you're a parent and you realize that failure is pain. And even though there's an advantage to pain, this is not an advantage we seek out. It's an advantage that if we experience pain, now the smart thing to do is to channel that experience and grow from that experience. But I don't think we would seek out pain for the benefit. So both can be true. It's possible that Eve understands that there is a benefit to succumbing to the temptation, even though God says it's not good. But she senses that the transformation is possible. And when we transform the evil, ultimately, that's that we get to a deeper, we deepen our relationship with God, and we deepen our understanding of and the meaning of our existence. So it's very possible that Eve is tempted by this. So when you say that Eve is tempted by the fruit, it's not just the physical fruit, it's by what the fruit represents. Because in the Garden of Eden is tranquility, and people who have tranquility, people who have peace, are looking for challenge. So it's possible that Eve is tempted by the challenge of transformation. And it is a painful process, but at the end of the process, it's more meaningful. So I agree with that. It's possible that's what Eve wants to do. Does God want it? God is a parent. God doesn't want us to have pain. God would rather us not experience the pain. But once we experience the pain, then God says, okay, ladies and gentlemen, now the painful experience could be a catalyst to greater growth. Now, if this is true, then it would make sense, at least from the perspective of the Kabbalah, why the woman would be the one to be more tempted to take this avenue. Because as we will discuss when we get there, from the perspective of the Kabbalah, the woman has much more of a sense of the innate good within every creation. Man, the Talmud says man wants to do battle, and woman is not looking for battle necessarily. The woman is much, again, with all the proper, what's the word I'm looking for? With all the proper disclosures, that when we say man and woman, we don't mean necessarily the biological man and woman. We mean that there's a masculine attributes and feminine attributes, and both, according to the Kabbalah, both males and females possess both these attributes because we each have a soul that has 10 attributes. Some of those attributes are masculine, and some of those attributes are feminine. And the masculine attributes that people have is combative. And combative means when I see the other person, I see the other person as an opponent. I see the other person as someone who doesn't see the world the way I do, and therefore I have to dominate that other person. That's the male perspective. Again, you could be a male that doesn't have this aspect. You could be a female that does have the masculine attributes. But we're talking about what the Kabbalah would label as masculine attributes, referring to the idea of dominance. And to dominate is to realize that I have to use force because that other person disagrees with me. Now, the feminine attribute, according to the Kabbalah, and again, you could be a male and female. Both male and female possess these attributes, depending on which one is more dominant. But everybody has this possibility. But what we call the feminine aspect is to cultivate. In other words, I can communicate with the other person and discuss and ultimately realize and help that other person realize that they agree with me. In other words, that we're on the same page, that not everything is a battle. And the art of cultivation is what ultimately the art of transformation is. Because if the male sees the negative as an opposing force to God, so what does the male want to do? The male attribute, it wants to fight it. But the feminine could see it, the male, and the negativity, and see this not as something that has to be destroyed, but as something that can be transformed. If this is true, then it's possible that this explains why Eve is tempted to take the route of transformation as opposed to the route of separation, which means I don't want to engage in it, because it's possible that the feminine energy is the one that is much more in tuned to the possibility of the transformation of evil. So we will discuss this hopefully at great length when we get to the continuation of the story. the end of, sort of the aftermath of the sin, but we're still trying to define the terms before we figure out what the aftermath of the sin is and why who sinned and why they didn't sin. We're still trying to figure out what exactly is the sin. In other words, what's at stake here. So just to repeat.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Wonderful.
Thank you. So the first idea, the first definition of tree of knowledge is we used to have objective knowledge, now we get subjective knowledge. Second interpretation is we used to have knowledge that doesn't affect us. Now, if you eat of the fruit of this tree, whatever you know affects you. So you can't sit and watch violence and say, I am immune to the effects of the evil, right? So I'm going to engage in watching the entertainment, right? I don't want to go back to, I don't want to talk about modern society because I don't want to offend anybody. So we'll go back to the Roman Colosseums where you have people get together to watch violence. So it's just entertainment. Doesn't work that way. If you're watching it, and certainly if you're enjoying it, that it's affecting you and that's taking a toll on your soul. Now you are emotionally connected to this negativity, to this evil, and you can't say that it's just not, I just know about it, but it doesn't affect me. Knowing about it will affect you. Now, is that good or bad? It's just a different world. The world becomes much more complicated once I have not only the understanding of evil, but also the knowledge of evil. So then we get to Nachmanides, and Nachmanides offers an interpretation, and later Abarbanel doesn't agree with it, but he adjusts it a little bit and makes it more palpable to the Abarbanel. So that's the next two steps that we're going to go. Says Nachmanides. Again, our problem is man's greatest quality is intelligence. So how could it be that knowledge is somehow depicted as something negative? Even knowledge of evil, but knowledge, what's wrong with knowledge? That's the starting question. So because of this question, Nachmanides offers another interpretation. And he says, look, ladies and gentlemen, what does knowledge mean? Knowledge in this context, in other words, remember in the Torah, there are all kinds of words for understanding. There's wisdom, understanding, knowledge, and there are others. So there are all kinds of words. What is the definition of the word knowledge? Says Nachmanides. Nachmanides says knowledge, reread the story, tree of knowledge. Knowledge is will or desire. In other words, read the story now. And Nachmanides says as follows. He says, everything that Adam and Eve did before they consumed of the fruit of the tree of knowledge, they did by instinct. You're hungry, so you eat. But there wasn't necessarily pleasure and desire. And why would they procreate? They would procreate because why would they have intimacy for procreation? Because that's a natural need. But they did not necessarily have the desire for the physical pleasures. Says Nachmanides, the moment you eat of the fruit of the tree of knowledge, now the knowledge you had earlier, in other words, the intellectual capacity to understand evil you had earlier, the intellectual capacity to understand the physical reality that you experienced earlier, what you gain once you consume of the fruit of the tree of knowledge, says Nachmanides, is now you have will. Now we see that it's a problem. Tree of knowledge of good and evil means now you have desire for good and evil. Okay, now I understand. Desire for evil is a negative. Understanding evil is okay. Understanding is a intellectual thing. And again, the advantage of man, the superiority of man is man's knowledge. So Nachmanides has a problem labeling any form of knowledge as negative, as bad. So Nachmanides says that when the Torah says dat, in this context, the Torah means will, desire. So the tree of knowledge of good and evil means that once I consume this fruit of this tree, now I actually want both good and both evil. And that obviously is a problem because a person desiring evil is already it's negative, and it certainly places you outside the Garden of Eden, because once I desire for good and desire for evil, then there's tension in my life. And if there's tension in my life, it's not the state of tranquility of the Garden of Eden. So if I embrace and engage in that, if I want to experience that desire for evil, then I can do so, but I can't do so in the Garden of Eden, because the Garden of Eden represents a place of tranquility where there is no negativity, where there is no tension within the person. Okay, what is the problem with this interpretation? So Abarbanel, who lives about 300 years after the Nachmanides, he doesn't like that interpretation. He doesn't like that interpretation. Because that seems like man was a robot. Man was a robot. In other words, Nachmanides seems to depict a scenario where you ate because you had a biological need, you didn't have desire, everything you did, you just did because you need to survive, but you didn't have a desire for the negative or for the physical. And Abarbanel doesn't like that. He says that's not. He says it's hard to accept, because we know that the nature of the person is that a person has choice, and the reason why we have choice is because we're combined of both soul and body. So we have the needs of the soul and the needs of the body, and we're created as a creature with free choice, because we have these two parts within ourselves: part of us that desires good and part of us that desires evil. So Abarbanel does not like to accept the notion of Nachmanides that before the tree of the knowledge, a person had no desire for physical things or negative things whatsoever. But he does still accept the kernel of Nachmanides' idea. And this is interesting how he takes the idea of Nachmanides and he just he uses it a little bit, he changes it a little bit, and then uses it for his own interpretation. So what Nachmanides says is that consumption of the fruit of the tree of knowledge has the power not to make somebody desire from the state of no desire to the state of desire. No, person was created with the desire for both something, for physical things as well as spiritual things, for positive things as well as negative things. That's innate within the makeup of the human soul, because of the fact that the human is a hybrid of body and soul, of physical and spiritual. But what does the fruit of the tree of knowledge do according to Abarbanel? Abarbanel says the fruit of the tree of knowledge increases the tava, the desire, the temptation. In other words, naturally, there's a certain desire I have for things physical or for things negative. But that natural desire is much easier for the mind to keep at bay, to keep it healthy, to keep it channeled. But the question then becomes, do I want to feel an intense passion for negativity? And if I eat of the tree of the fruit of the tree of knowledge, then I will get an intense passion for negative, and that will complicate my life. It will also have certain advantages, as we will discuss. But that's why God says, better stay away from this tree, because what this tree represents is creating an intense passion for negativity. And without this tree, says Abarbanel, not like Nachmanides, who says you would have no desire for anything physical or negative. Abarbanel says you would have had desire for things physical and negative, but that desire would not be intense, and therefore it would be much easier to channel and control. But once you engage in the fruit of the tree of knowledge, now this desire is much more powerful and much harder to rein in. And he brings a very interesting, very interesting detail. Let me see if I can find it in my notes. Otherwise I have to say from, oh, here it is. Oh, this is good. This is very good. So later we're going to discuss this concept where somehow or another, when the serpent engages with Eve in discussion, which we'll discuss what that means, what exactly that means. But in the conversation between the serpent and Eve, a problem arises. What's the problem? The problem is that Eve tells the serpent that God said we cannot touch the tree. And that was simply not true, because God told Adam we can't eat of the fruit of the tree. But God never told Adam that you can't eat, you can't touch the tree. So there's a whole interpretation what exactly happened. The rabbinic interpretation is that Eve was misinformed because Adam was afraid. He did not want Eve to eat of the fruit of the tree. So he wanted to keep her away. So what he did, he added to the decree, to the mitzvah. God says don't eat. And Adam told Eve, don't touch either. And that was part of the problem of why they failed, because according to the Medrash, and I'll explain what that means, but according to the Medrash, the serpent pushes Eve and she touches the tree. And then the serpent says, hey, nothing happened when you touched the tree, so obviously nothing will happen when you consume of the fruit of the tree. So that's another whole discussion, what exactly that means. We'll get to that in good health, God willing. But before you even go there, says that Abarbanel, what we see from here is that there are two concepts. There is seeing the tree, or three things. There's seeing the tree and touching the tree. That is okay. That God did not prohibit. And then there is consuming of the fruit of the tree. Says Abarbanel that seeing the tree and touching the tree represents the fact that we could have some desire for things physical and things negative. Not an intense desire, but some desire. And says that Abarbanel, that actually is not only not prohibited, that is actually healthy. And that's why you're allowed to touch the tree. And you're allowed to look at the tree. And maybe even you should touch the tree and look at the tree. Because God wants us to have some desire for physical. You have to eat breakfast. It has to taste good. You have to want it. You're not a robot, the way Maimonides tries to make it, that we're just intellectual creatures that have no, let me finish the point, that have no desire and no emotional attachment and no will toward the physical and the negative. No, you're supposed to have some desire for things physical. And that's why touching it and seeing it is actually okay. What's prohibited is to eat, because eat means that would intensify the desire. An intense desire could lead to negative side effects. There's always a flip side. It could actually be, because remember, there's always a flip side, because what happens is, and this is possible, going back to Jill's point, why Eve wants to engage, and Seth's point, when you get intense desire, you're getting intense desire to evil, but what also happens is you have the capacity for intense desire to good, and you did not have that capacity before. So every coin has two sides to the coin. So we're going to discuss that as we continue. But even before that, we're still in the very beginning of the story. We're still trying to figure out what exactly does the tree of knowledge represent and why is it bad. So we had so far 4 interpretations. We're going to run by them quickly, then open the floor for questions, and then we'll conclude, because we're concluding early. Number 1, some people say before Maimonides, before the tree of knowledge, we had objective knowledge. Post the tree of knowledge, we have subjective knowledge. The Hasidic interpretation, before the tree of knowledge, we have wisdom and understanding, which represents intellectual understanding that does not affect you how you feel. Once you consume the tree of knowledge, because the Kabbalistic idea of knowledge is the bridge to the heart, and then what you know impacts how you feel. So the knowledge of evil is going to make me feel evil. Third interpretation is Nachmanides, which means he says we're able to understand evil intellectually, or physicality intellectually, but we have no desire for it whatsoever. And once we consume the fruit of the tree of knowledge, now we have a desire for physical and the negative. Nachmanides and Abarbanel does not like that answer, because he doesn't want to say that we have no desire whatsoever. We were more like robots. He wants to say that by definition, the human being feels both for good and for evil, because he is a hybrid of body and soul. And therefore, Abarbanel adjusts builds off of what Nachmanides says. And he says, yes, tree of knowledge is desire. But notice that touching the tree and looking at the tree is okay. Some desire for physical and negative is healthy. What is unhealthy is obsessive desire. And you look around the world and you look at history and you see some people, when they do things that are destructive, it's irrational. It's so irrational, but that's the nature. We have some animal within us. We have a part of ourselves that's destructive, that has an intense desire to do things that we ourselves know is negative and will endanger our well-being and our happiness. But that's the nature of the beast. That is what happens to us once. And that's our psychological state in the world post tree of knowledge. In other words, Abarbanel says, desire is good. Intense desire is less good.
Rabbi, didn't anyone develop the idea that to eat of the tree of knowledge makes you godlike and act as if you know what is good and bad for sure?
Oh, and that's all the interpretations touch upon this. In other words, when you talk about subjective and objective, let's just start, for example, for one, Maimonides. God is the ultimate, at least from our perspective. God, what is moral? What's moral is what God desires. In other words, what is moral? there is objective morality, okay? I know some people are going to get offended, but we'll keep that for another discussion. We don't have the time. Let's assume for the purpose of this discussion that there is objective morality. And what is good is what is objectively good. In other words, what God decides what's good. Says the serpent to the human being, you eat this fruit of this tree, you get subjective knowledge. If you get subjective knowledge, then you determine what's moral. What is moral? Whatever makes me feel good. If we have 7 billion people on the planet and each person decides what's moral based on what makes them feel good, what do you have? You have exactly what you don't have in the Garden of Eden. You have the jungle. So in other words, go ahead.
Maybe we're supposed to make decisions. That's the point. And we're supposed to make a decision. And oftentimes, especially as a parent, you make a decision that doesn't make you feel good, but it's still the right decision. The last thing I want to ask is, you had talked about touching the tree. Isn't touching, in other words, God gives you one more way to like research out your decision. And after that, is that correct analysis?
Yes, touching, again, Nachman, Rabbanel says, touching me
It's a way to make sure.
Yes, touching represents that you have some engagement, but consuming is much more deeper. Remember, consuming is that you're taking it within yourself. Okay. When you touch something, it's still external. Once you consume it, it becomes part of you.
But you have the choice once you touch it. You say, I don't want it, or you want it.
Indeed.
Is that right?
That's correct. Indeed.
Rabbi?
I make a lot of mistakes.
Don't worry, you're in good company. Don't worry about it.
A lot.
Rabbi?
Yes, go ahead, please.
It seems to me, of course, I'm more of obviously my knowledge is more secular humanism, and it very much corresponds to moral absolutism versus moral relativism. And God made, I think that I kind of agree with a point Seth made earlier, is that if God wanted us to just have moral absolutism, we would be like the angels. And he wanted us to be different than that. He wanted us to make choices. And
okay, so this is a big subject, and I can't do it in 2 minutes, but I'll give you the spoiler. The spoiler alert is that the Torah, if the Torah gives you the 10 commandments, like Dennis Prager says, the 10 commandments are called 10 commandments. They're not called 10 suggestions.
right.
In other words, you gotta give the guy credit. He gave a good quote. He's also happens to be my wife's cousin. His grandmother was a Hecht, so he's related. So I can quote him. But the point is this: the point is that the Torah's perspective is that there is morality. Murder is wrong across the board, right? So there is morality. Then the question becomes, am I the ultimate arbitrator of do I always know the ultimate morality? The answer is no. And therefore you open up the Talmud, every page is disagreement. But the disagreement is we have to try to understand what the ultimate morality is. We have to have the humility to understand that we don't always know. I mean, sometimes we're right and sometimes we're wrong. And there's a process to try to figure out what's right and wrong. But the underlying understanding is that yes, there is a truth out there that I have to conform to. If I feel murder is good, and the 10 Commandments says murder is bad, I have to bend my feeling toward, I'll be very happy if I can kill my neighbor, I'll be honest with you, right? Let's say, right? And it makes me feel good. So maybe that's moral, right? And I have to say, listen, my friend, I know this is what makes me feel good, but it's still not good, right? So the Torah's perspective is, yes, there is certain absolute truths. Do I have the capacity to always know the absolute truth? No. And that's part of all we do in the study of Torah is debate and understand that we don't always have the truths. It's very, that's the oral Torah. The oral Torah is so much about debate, and debate requires that humility that we don't know. But the point of the matter is we're trying to determine what that is. If I would tell you, look, Beth, we're going to live in a world where every person decides for themselves what's moral for them. So I feel that taking the red light is moral for me. That's what I feel. What are you going to tell me? I'm wrong? Too bad. That's what I feel. So if we get to that point, then it's a lot of things, but it's not the Garden of Eden. It's not peace, it's not tranquility, and it's not truth and falsehood. It's good and evil.
Right. No, I'm not suggesting that there isn't an absolute morality, but I think that God wanted us to struggle with it,
Absolutely.
as opposed to
Because
just
we're in a-
handing it, sort of handing it to us on a silver platter. He really wanted us to struggle with
and
it.
just to make a plug for the Talmud. The Talmud is the one religious work, probably the only religious work that allows for all that doubt and uncertainty. You would expect typically the religion tells you absolutes, and the Bible is like that. The Bible tells you what's right and wrong. And I don't know of another religion that can come up with a book like the Talmud, where all the Talmud is, we're not sure what's right and wrong. We know there is a right and wrong. We're not sure of our ability to achieve it. We're not sure of our ability to prove it, but that's the struggle. So as a religious work, the Talmud as a religious work, a work of uncertainty, I think is unique.
Right.
Okay. I would love to sit here and discuss this all day, honestly. There's nowhere else I would rather be. But unfortunately, the time has come to depart. Until next time. And I'm looking forward to seeing everybody in the future in good health. Have a wonderful day, wonderful week.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Good week,
Rabbi
Rabbi.
Yakala.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Be well.
Thank
Thank you.
Rabbi.